Hi, Victoria. You prefer Tori, right?
Yes.
Okay. Was it weird being called Victoria the whole time?
No, all
Okay.
through school I was called Victoria. So.
All right. As someone whose name is also often shortened and used to having it shortened in conversation, yeah. I went through a phase in grad school where I sort of liked my dissertation advisor, the guy who became my advisor. He insisted on calling me Benjamin, and I kind of liked that. So for a while, I would be like, no, it's Benjamin. But I couldn't quite keep it up. I couldn't quite keep it up the whole time. It became too weird. So I was like, no, Ben is fine.
I like Tori. I like my name, Victoria, because it's like regal kind of and like formal. And then I love Tori because it's just like short and sweet. And Tori is kind of like a little bit like less feminine to me, which is kind of how I am. I'm just like, whatever, I'm just Tori. I just
it suits you. You're like, it fits right. Yeah.
Yeah, it fits right.
I get it. Thank you so much for your paper last session.
Oh, thank you for coming.
I hope you were happy with how it all went.
Yes, I was so happy with how it all went. We had a really good turnout for that session.
Mm-hmm.
So, and everyone seemed engaged. Which was good.
It's always unfortunate when someone drops out or can't deliver a paper, and it can be a little stressful thinking like, wait, how are we going to fill the time if there's only 2 papers? But we had no trouble, did we? We had no trouble.
No, we still had like 24 questions when we ended the session.
Right. Yeah, I hope Amy can. Maybe Amy can share the chat, or maybe you can have access to that yourself, probably to the chat, so you'll be able to see it. But maybe Nina can get sent the chat.
Yes.
So
absolutely. This panel looks really cool too.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
Fun papers. Drew's in this one.
Mm-hmm.
Anna and Joshua. Mm-hmm.
I'll try to behave myself because I see the recording is on, unless you want to pause it, or I guess Welcome everybody to what promises to be an excellent session on the day 4 of the 2022 Woolf Conference. This is, just so you know, you're in the right place, Unfinished Business, Ethics, and Archives. What I'm going to do is introduce each of our speakers before their paper. And so I'll be introducing Joshua in just a moment. He'll deliver his paper, and then I've found it very helpful to have a few-minute break between papers just to finish writing notes or to jot questions or just to clear my mind a little bit. And after that break, I'll then introduce Drew and so on and so forth. So, and then we'll have, I'm sure, a rich Q&A session after the 3rd paper. So, okay, so up first, Joshua Phillips holds a PhD from the University of Glasgow. In September, he will begin a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship at the University of Oxford, where he will be working on a project titled The Digital Anon, a digital genetic edition of Virginia Woolf's final essays. He has published articles in Woolf Studies Annual and Textual, for some reason that word sounds weird to me for some reason, Textual Cultures, contributes to the year's work in English studies and was postgraduate representative for the British Association of Modernist Studies. Thank you for that service to the field, Joshua. All right, Joshua, go ahead, take us away.
Thank you, Ben. I'll just share my screen. Can you all see that okay?
Yes, great. I can.
So, in this paper, I discuss Virginia Woolf's final essay drafts. Specifically, I want to talk about the literary historical project she wrote in the final months of her life, but never finished. Drafted concurrently with the novel Between the Acts and A Sketch of the Past, Woolf conceived of her literary history as one that would go through English literature like a string through cheese, referring to it variously as a common history, and as a 3rd volume of The Common Reader, as Reading at Random, or as Turning the Page, although today the project has become best known by the dual title of Anon and The Reader. From the 24th of November 1940 to her death on the 28th of March 1941, she wrote a number of fragmentary drafts towards this common history as war raged in Europe and overhead. These drafts range from some 2 to 26 pages in length, although many of the fragments seem to be just that, fragments of longer documents which are no longer extant. Some of this draft material is extant in a holograph notebook, a handwritten one kept between 1938 and 1939, in which there are drafts of contemporaneous essays, short stories, and bits of between the acts. The remainder of the material encompassed by this project was written either by hand or by typewriter on loose leaf paper. It's all housed in the New York Public Library's Berg collection, where it was sorted and catalogued. And as I discuss elsewhere, this act of curation shapes pretty much all later encounters with the documents, including my own. Woolf's literary history is a radical one, and it's not premised on the big names of English literature. It stems from what Woolf terms the nameless vitality of Anon, the unnamed poet-singer, or poet-singers plural, whose unrecorded voice prefigures and makes possible English literary production. Woolf's literary history theorizes the decline of anonymous subjectivity, first at the hands of Caxton's printing press, then as a distinctly modern readerly subjectivity emerges in the 16th and 17th century. Readers are most likely to have encountered this narrative in the 1979 Brenda Silver edition, which forms the basis for the one in the final of the 6-volume essays of Virginia Woolf, as well as in Bonnie Kind-Scott's anthology, The Gender of Modernism. This edition, and sort of by analogy, the ones that are based on it, is an eclectic one, insofar as it takes portions from various draft fragments and molds them into a cohesive reading text. In doing so, I think that it misses somewhat what's so formally distinctive about this archive, and more on that later. Having said all this, I don't want to spend too much time tracing the arc of Woolf's literary history or getting into the weeds of the archive, what she wrote and when she wrote it, nor how it's been approached by editors. I'll link to an article where I expand in far greater depth on just this at the end of the paper. Rather, what I want to do is introduce a much snappier title for the paper, which conveniently came to me just too late to change it in the program. This title is The Work of Anonymity. And this title speaks to a double order of ethics that I want to tease out or work through over the course of this paper. Do I mean work as noun or verb here? Both, as you'll see on the slides. I posit here that the work of anonymity is a task, an effort, an endeavor, a labor, an undertaking, a project, but at the same time, to do the work of anonymity is to act, to create, to compose, to cultivate, to form, to make. It's an act of making, of poesis. And this double valence speaks at once to what I see as the central claim, or perhaps claims plural, of Woolf's ethics of anonymity and the ethics of approaching this archive. What then is this central claim? It takes 3 parts. The first is that anonymity is not just a mode of authorship, a form of publication that's signed but unsigned by its author, or perhaps which is signed by its lack of authorship. Rather, anonymity is a mode of subjectivity in and of itself. This leads me to the second component of my claim, of this claim, my second thesis, that it's a mode of subjectivity that's premised on collectivity and co-creation. As such, it's irreducible to, radically different from, the forms of modern subjectivity, punctual and private, that Woolf contends emerges in the in the 16th and 17th century as the modern figure of the reader comes into view. It's perhaps a mode of subjectivity that allows one to escape the overweening shadow of the straight, dark bar of a room of one's own, the shadow shaped something like the letter I. My final thesis is that Woolf's mode of anonymous subjectivity is one that she believes can be recovered in contemporary times, whether in the middle of the 20th century or in the opening decades of the 21st, through acts of imaginative identification with the past. As is so often the case in this archive, Woolf works and reworks the passages in which she thought through anonymity as a mode of being that can be recovered, and I'll talk about that in greater depth later in the paper. In one draft fragment, Woolf, catalogued as M53 in the by the Berg curators and included in the silver edition, Woolf writes, "By choosing a view carefully to shut out a chimney or a bungalow, we can still see what Anon saw. The bird-haunted, reed-whispering fen, the down covered with turf and the scar long healed over the moor, over the down, along which Anon came when he made his journeys." What I find striking about this passage, beyond the quiet susurration of the bird-haunted reed whispering fen, its faintly hypnotic pulsating dactyls and its hushed sibilance, is its hopefulness. Even though the down is covered with, not by turf anymore, but by bungalows, and Woolf certainly had something to say about those, if we can still see what Anon saw, if we cultivate a sensibility that allows us to do so. Woolf does not, this I think is a crucial part of Woolf's project, of her historiography. Woolf does not turn to literary history at this moment of crisis as a form of nostalgia, a way of looking back into a bygone past, into a past without chimneys or bungalows. Rather, her history is, I think, future-oriented. Anonymity becomes a once and future mode of subjectivity that can be recruited as part of the mental fight Woolf calls for in Thoughts on Peace as an Air Raid, a way of thinking against the current, not with it. This future-oriented literary history reminds me of another work of modernist historiography from the archives, drafted more or less contemporaneously with this one, Walter Benjamin's On the Concepts of History. I'm far from the first to make this link, of course. Angeliki Spiripoulou discusses it in much greater depth than I can here in her monograph, Virginia Woolf, Modernity and History. But what I want to do by drawing this connection is highlight that there's something distinctly Benjaminian about Woolf's drafts, that she too seeks to draw constellations between past and present, and that these constellations face towards the future. Woolf's figuration of anonymity, then, is a complex and multivalent one where the creation of constellations between the past and the present becomes an ethical imperative. But to complicate matters further, Woolf's figuration of anonymity is not conveyed in a textually simple matter. As I said earlier, there's not one essay called Anon or the Reader. Rather, the essays are extant as a system of draft fragments that bear witness to Woolf's continuing attempts to think through, work through her distinctive vision of literary history as she writes it. Woolf thinks through her texts textually, and the form of this archive bears witness to this. The quietly susurrating passage I read just now is one variant of many. each imbued with subtly different valences. I hesitate to say precisely how many tropes, images, figurations Woolf writes and rewrites throughout the drafts. The drafts of Anon and the Reader are a prime example of what Hans Walter Gabler calls autographic writing, which is to say writing that is not vexed. It's draft writing, typically drafts or notes. Autographic writing, he says, does not record text for reading, but rather acts to record, support, and engender further composition. Approaching autographic writing necessitates a different ethical orientation towards the text than a reader might take to an allographic text, one that is vexed and inscribes a text to be read by another, at a later date, by a reader perhaps the same as the writer, or perhaps a different reader. Allographic texts might be later drafts, they might be proofs or galleys, or published texts. So editing this collection of fragments poses ethical quandaries. I don't want to talk too much about how my upcoming projects, a digital edition of these fragments, will be shaped. In no small part, this is because I've yet to figure it out. But figuring this out, I think, will be part of the fun. What I want to do is highlight that building this project, finding an apposite form through which to represent Woolf's work of anonymity, is an ethical dilemma as much as it is a technical or a formal one. This collection of textual questions is richly generative. Woolf's drafts can be seen as an experiment in writing a new old form of subjectivity, a mode of subjectivity that is irreducible to simple identity, a mode of subjectivity in which one cannot, to paraphrase Mrs. Dalloway somewhat, say of oneself, I am this, I am that. And this experiment takes a form that is experimental, essayistic in the etymological sense of the word. The Anon and the Reader fragments theorize a mode of subjectivity that eludes the taxonomic impulse to pin down and to classify, and their form is apt to their contents. I want to wrap this paper up now with a quick reflection on one of the final fragments, categorized as M112, and very likely one of the last pieces Woolf would ever write. It ends with the line, "We are in a world where nothing is concluded." In the narrative of the typescripts, this speaks to the generative potential of the written words, but I think this line is apt also to the form of the fragments and to the work of anonymity, both as a noun and a verb. The ethical imperative of anonymous subjectivity is an imperative whose promise can never quite be fulfilled, only ever works towards. And it is theorized in a constellation of draft fragments whose very form forestalls conclusivity. The work of anonymity is without end. Thanks. Thank you for listening. Didn't mean to do that. Thanks, and I'll pop the access copy of this in the chat.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Great paper. All right, let's take maybe 2 minutes. I'm going to turn my camera off, and when I turn it back on, we can get started again. But 2 minutes just to gather thoughts, stand up, stretch your legs, get a drink, whatever you need, and we'll be back to hear Drew's presentation. If everyone could wave at Gwen's visitor, that would maybe be lovely. Welcome. We're glad you're here with us. Okay, why don't we move on? We all know Drew, but I will introduce him anyway. Drew Shannon is an associate professor of English at Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he teaches primarily British literature from Shakespeare to the present, as well as courses in writing, diaries and memoirs, and theater. For 10 years, he served as director and producer of Mount St. Joseph's theater program. He's currently finishing The Deep Old Desk, a biography of the diary of Virginia Woolf. Drew, go ahead.
Thank you, Ben. I don't have a PowerPoint. I think I exhausted all of my PowerPoint abilities on the thing that you're seeing with Ellen McLaughlin this afternoon. So also the scans that I took from Woolf's manuscript diaries, I was told I was not allowed to share those for various reasons, which we'll talk about shortly, I'm sure. But this is called Will You Destroy? There is an access copy if you'd like to follow along in the chat. This is called Will You Destroy All My Papers? Virginia Woolf's Diaries on the Ethics of Archival Research. What am I doing here, seated at this wooden table beneath this green glass lamp? The sounds of Fifth Avenue, the hawkers, the shoppers, the hot dog salesmen, the tumult and riot and busyness of it all still rings in my ears in the hush of the Berg collection of the New York Public Library, where Virginia Woolf's diaries live. And live is the word. There is her handwriting racing across the page. She's really cooking here, and her nib scarcely leaves the paper, the words running together in one long blur of letters. There is the volume before me on the table. Unlike its predecessors, this one is a ringed binder covered in black paper with pink and green and white abstract floral designs. On the spine is a square sticker, 1937 it reads, in her handwriting. In the center of the front cover is a white oval, partly covered by a pink circle which has been glued over it. There are streaks from the brush of the glue pot. Inside the cover is pasted an at-a-glance calendar for 1936. Number 70, Walker's Year at View Calendar Refill Number 70, London. The black paper from the cover partly overlaps the left-hand corner of this calendar. It appears as though she glued that cover paper on herself. The upper right-hand corner of the calendar is torn, as though she tried to tear it out slowly and then gave up. Most of the entries are on loose-leaf paper. Some, dated from the 25th of May, recounting a trip to France, are, a rarity for this diary, typed poorly, in fact, with many handwritten corrections. Internal evidence suggests that these typed pages were reconstituted from notes taken on the journey. What happened to the notes? And why did she try to tear out the calendar? Was the binder purchased for use in 1936 but not used until 1937? This is what I mean by live. Magnificent as the published volumes of Woolf's diaries are, and I will never cease to be grateful to Anne Olivier Bell and Mitchell Liaska for their Herculean work on these volumes, they cannot compare to what I'm seeing in this room, at this table, under this lamp. There is her handwriting, still difficult to decipher, but which has gradually revealed itself to me after years of studying it. There is her attempt to rip out a calendar. I imagine her peeling back the cover, seeing the paper tear, perhaps scoffing in frustration. In all my years of reading Woolf's diaries, at the remove of the printed page, I have never felt once like a voyeur. Is that the word? No. Intruder? Too violent. But I certainly feel like a something seated here at this table, a something I've never felt when reading those impeccably edited volumes. There is life, breath here. It's the closest I've ever felt to Virginia Woolf, closer ever even than when standing in the rooms she occupied at Monk's house, for this is her lifeblood on the pages. This is her most intimate writing, herself enclosed in the loops and dips and darts of her handwriting. And it occurs to me what the problem might be. We might reasonably assume that the last sentence Virginia Woolf wrote in her life is the last sentence of her suicide note to Leonard on the 28th of March, 1941. After signing her initials, she turned the paper sideways and wrote, after a note about Roger Fry's letters to the Morans, "Will you destroy all my papers?" With a period, not a question mark. Sitting here, her 1937 diary before me, I speculate again about this sentence and about Leonard's decision to ignore it, and about his arranging for her papers not only to be preserved, but to eventually be deposited through the agency of the Mrs. Hamlin Barker of Chicago in such august institutions as the Byrd Collection, the British Library, the University of Sussex, and to have them published very nearly in full. This sentence complicates everything I am feeling at this moment at this table. I expected to feel excited, which I am. I expected to have tears in my eyes, which I do. What I did not expect was the feeling of looking over Woolf's shoulder, of snooping, a feeling at once exciting and naughty, ecstatic and shameful. Would I be feeling this if I'd never read the last sentence Virginia Woolf ever wrote? Almost certainly not, but I did read it. To unpack this feeling, I tell myself that there is a certain sense in which I am off the hook, ethically. I, after all, did not ignore Virginia's final sentence. I did not place her diaries in the Byrd collection. I did not edit and publish them. That burden lies on Leonard Woolf, the Mrs. Hamlin Barker, Quentin and Olivier Bell and Mitchell Liaska, and the publishers at the Hogarth Press and Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. And there are several points to be raised about Virginia Woolf's final sentence. One, when she wrote it, she was at the lowest point of her life and might very well not have known what she was saying, was not considering the full implications of her request. Two, knowing Leonard as she did she think at all that it might be possible that he would have been capable of burning a single scrap of paper with her writing on it? She herself had convincingly prophesied what might happen to her diary, in particular after her death, in an entry from 20 March 1926, quote, "But what is to become of these diaries, I asked myself yesterday. If I died, what would Leo make of them? He would be disinclined to burn them," emphasis mine. He could not publish them. Well, he should make up a book from them and then burn the body. I dare say there is a little book in them if all the scraps and scratches were straightened out a little, God knows, end quote. And this, of course, is just what Leonard did with them in 1953 in a writer's diary. 3, Woolf herself was a devoted, compulsive reader of other people's diaries and letters, famous or obscure, as Barbara Lounsbury has illustrated comprehensively in her 3-volume work on the diaries. Woolf well knew the uses to which private papers could be put, and we can fairly assume that she was grateful to these writers' executors that they didn't destroy these works. But now that I think about it, this could exactly be the reason why she ultimately wished for hers to be destroyed. After all, anonymity was important to her. She wanted people to know her work, but not her life. She was scornful of the biographical chapter in Winifred Holtby's 1932 book about her. Finally, 4, she willed some of her manuscripts to other people, including a novel, unspecified, to Vita Sackville West, as indicated in an exchange between Vita and Leonard in May 1941. Thus, at least some manuscripts were intended to be kept and passed on, and not all of her papers would therefore fall under the dictates of that final sentence. Vita, by the way, eventually accepted the manuscript of Mrs. Galloway from Leonard. I can't fathom any Woolf scholar, past, present, or to come, who truly wishes that Leonard had followed through with Virginia's final request. Those of us who've read her diaries find in them solace, comfort, intellectual stimulation, and a window into a mind and a time and a place. The other writers I've read on Woolf's diaries haven't seemed troubled by the implications of Woolf's last sentence. Is this just me? A particular neurosis of mine? Too much lingering guilt from a Catholic boyhood? I recently discovered an article by Heidi A. Mckee and James E. Porter, 2 professors of English at Miami University, just up the road from where I'm sitting, that addresses simply and eloquently what I'm feeling and why archival research can be so fraught. Archives are not just archives, they claim. Quote, "Those papers are also people." They continue, quote, "Existing in the liminal spaces between person and artifact, researcher and researched, archives create ethical gray zones for researchers where decisions about how to proceed or even whether to proceed can be difficult," end quote. Mckee and Porter offer in their piece a heuristic to guide ethical decision-making when working with archival material, and it's worth applying this to Woolf's diaries. If nothing else, it might alleviate my qualms and the qualms of any Woolf scholars who work with these manuscripts in the future. So we can posit that there are three types of participant in archival research: the owners of the manuscripts and or the executors of the estate, which are sometimes the same people, the gatekeepers or custodians of the manuscripts once they've arrived in institutional or private collections, and finally the researchers themselves. Mckee and Porter acknowledge that the initial ethical burden, as I indicated above, lies with the owners of the manuscripts after the writer's deaths. And they provide several examples, both real and hypothetical, in which executors honor or ignore the writer's wishes. In one instance, in which researcher Linda Bergman sought to examine the papers of the scholar Marcia Tillotson, who wanted her papers destroyed after her death, but whose mother wanted them preserved and published, the question of whose wishes to honor weighed heavily. Quote, "Did I owe more to Marcia, whom I had never met, to her mother, who paid me for my early transcriptions of the letters and for whom the letters remained profoundly important throughout her life, or to my own conviction of their value and worth for women's history, accounts of experiences that would otherwise be lost from sight?" End quote. Clearly, motivation on the part of the executor and researcher alike is a determination of whether or not the research is ethical. In the Bergman example, both she and Tillotson's mother were convinced of the importance of Tillotson's work for women's history and thus felt justified in ignoring Tillotson's wishes. No less a commentator than the former ethicist of the New York Times, Randy Cohen, weighed in on this very issue in a piece published on the 4th of November, 2007. Quote, "There are extraordinary cases where ethics compels us to disregard the demands of the dead in order to serve the profoundly important interests of the living. Several literary executors, for example, famously ignored a writer's instructions to destroy his papers, as Max Brod defied Kafka's demand, and posterity rightly applauds these acts of disobedience." End quote. Cohen might well have mentioned Leonard Woolf as well. While Leonard appears to have been paid $20,000 from the first sale of Virginia's manuscripts to the Berg in 1958, money seems not to have been a motivating factor in doing so. In a letter to Francis Hamill in 1956, Leonard agreed to the sale, quote, "provided that they were bought en bloc either by Harvard or Yale, with an understanding that they be kept together and made available for serious students," end quote. From what I can tell, Leonard's decision was not met with much criticism in or out of Bloomsbury. But there was at least one person who was appalled by Leonard's decision to publish extracts from Virginia's diaries in a writer's diary, his brother Edgar. In a venomous letter in which he also attacks Leonard for the vitriolic way in which Leonard depicted the Woolf family in The Wise Virgins and Principia Politica, Edgar writes, quote, "It is not for me to question the decency of a man selling his wife's tragedy for gold. Having always been the lick-spittle of greater intellects, you suffer from the deformity of the little man who thinks it makes him greater to cry out, 'See how I have risen above my degraded beginnings.' Unfortunately, with your mean nature, you'll go on the same way and delight in causing pain to all of us. But Virginia's diary shows you up for what you are better than any words of mine." End quote. Edgar Woolf's rant notwithstanding, it seems fair to state that Leonard Woolf was not acting with malicious intent in allowing her diaries to be sold. Indeed, his selection in a writer's diary seems carefully cultivated so as to avoid causing offense to anyone still living at the time. And his desire for them to be published after her death and the deaths of most of the principal players suggests a level of sensitivity and care. Mckee and Porter only obliquely refer to the role of the gatekeepers in their discussion of the ethics of archival research, primarily in terms of their positions as guardians of the work of vulnerable or marginalized people, people who might be harmed in the present or posthumously by the revelation of certain material in their archives. This brings to mind another area of interest for me, the diarist Anais Nin, whose reputation was at its peak in the 1970s and was done tremendous damage by the posthumous publication of her unexpurgated diaries in the volumes Henry and June, Incest, Fire, Nearer the Moon, and others, which led to Nin being called, among other things, a slut, a tramp, and a whore in publications as august as the New Yorker. But Nin instructed the second of her two simultaneous husbands, Rupert Toll, to publish these extracts after the death of her first husband, Hugh Geiler, which certainly complicates the case. Derrida And people who know me can laugh at the absurdity of the fact that I'm actually quoting Derrida. Derrida in Archive Fever suggests that archives and archivists create their own order and that their classification and organization can trump that of the authors. This applies in a small way to Woolf's diaries, in that Anne Olivier Bell considers the diaries from 1915 to 1941 to be what she calls the main series, and the earlier diaries to be, quote, notebooks having something of the character of diaries. While I agree that the early diaries are different in character from the ones from 1915 onward, we have no evidence to suggest that Woolf herself thought of them as different, but they have passed into published history that way and are cataloged in the archive as such. So what do the Berg's recent curators have to say? The Bells dealt first with Dr. John Gordon, who on his death was succeeded by Dr. Lola Sloditz, who became legendary in literary circles and in the Woolf community. You know you've made it if you're a librarian who gets her own profile in the New Yorker magazine. Sloditz spoke, to use Hermione Lee's phrase, proprietorially about Woolf, calling her Virginia, and sighing with affection, quote, fortunately, intellect has no gender. She went on, we protect the written word at the Berg. It is a research collection, not a museum. It has to be used. My role at the Berg is to stand still and allow the collection to grow. In fact, I try to make time itself stand still here. I try to create quiet and timelessness that allows for the pursuit of truth, end quote. Sloditz's position here sounds oddly passive, as though the collection will grow around her without her effort or interference, when in fact the New Yorker profile of her depicts her as being relentless in her pursuit of new acquisitions. Curators have an ethical responsibility of maintaining the integrity of the collection. They obviously cannot allow fragile manuscripts to be handled indiscriminately. The Berg's most recent curators have different approaches to access. Isaac Gewirtz did not allow researchers to photograph or take scans of any Woolf diary pages, despite this not being prohibited by the estate. The current curator, Carolyn Vega, does. In conversation with me, Vega, who was new to the position when we spoke, echoed Sloditz and promised to make the Berg more accessible and more user-friendly. This was certainly the case during the pandemic lockdown, when the staff was extremely accommodating about looking up material and sending scans as needed. The ethical questions of access to a collection like the Berg, including the not so little matter of who can get in, and what about the scholars who can't afford to travel to New York, are beyond the scope of this paper, but they're worth pondering and are ripe for further conversation later. Which leaves the researchers themselves. Given that they are not responsible for the acquisition of the material in the archives, nor are they the custodians or gatekeepers who determine access, what do Mckee and Porter suggest are the ethical standards to which researchers must hold themselves? A researcher must investigate their own motives for doing the work. Curiosity alone is obviously not enough. Thousands are curious, and manuscripts cannot handle that level of intense handling. Mckee and Porter write, in archival work, a researcher's purpose might be to deepen our understanding of a particular person in a particular time, place, and culture. They maintain that as long as a researcher's motives are pure, that they're not out to discredit, demean, violate, degrade the author or the author's work, a convincing case for archival research can be made. And when there is hesitancy, when there is doubt, these are the times for questions to be asked of the community to which the researcher belongs. Mckee and Porter state that, quote, what we see archival researchers doing as a common practical strategy for addressing tough ethical questions is consulting with others, asking questions, and listening carefully and respectfully to a variety of interested parties whose views they honor and respect as wisdom, end quote, which I realize is what I'm doing here at this moment. Ultimately, when bluntly asking ourselves the question of whether or not archival research of personal writing is ethical, Mckee and Porter rather sheepishly give the standard philosopher's response, quote, it depends. Is it a person or is it a text, they ask. We are aware that the text is an extension of the person, expressing her thoughts, ideas, feelings, words, and even body. When we look at a piece of writing, we are highly attuned to the importance of seeing the person in and beyond the writing, and also of seeing the text and the person as part of a larger community, end quote. Is the community being served by this archival work? Is the author's work being violated or honored by the research, by the ends to which that research is put? Does the community benefit from the research in a manner that outweighs any squeamishness about access? I can't imagine anyone here or any Woolf scholar who wouldn't view Woolf's manuscripts with reverence and who would use them for nefarious ends. Nor can I imagine any Woolf scholar who is not profoundly grateful that Leonard ignored Virginia's final sentence and who has not been moved and amused and fed and sustained by the contents of her diary. And as for myself, I believe in the integrity of my own motives. My desire to access the archive is to enhance my work on her diaries, to provide readers with glimpses into the work they cannot see from the published volumes alone. It certainly isn't for money, or even at this point for much in the way of professional advancement. It is for the sole purpose of providing illumination, which I believe should be the sole aim of all literary criticism. Her diaries sit in a climate-controlled vault in the Berg, with particular attention paid to temperature and humidity. I trust that Carolyn Vega and her staff have their best interests in mind. And perhaps I can visit the Berg again soon with less angst, knowing that my intentions are good and noble and true. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Drew. Wonderful panel so far. Let's take another 2-minute break, and then we'll come back and I'll introduce our third presenter. And then after that, we'll move into our Q&A session. So 2-minute break again. Okay, now for our third presenter. Anna Quiring received her PhD in English from Washington University in St. Louis in April 2022. So if we could all, congratulations, Anna, for that achievement, where she is now a postdoctoral fellow. Her research concerns modernist and 20th century women writers, feminist theory, and fat studies. We're so happy to have you here, Anna. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so sorry to be late. I was thinking I'm going to talk about amateurism today. So this was a little piece of performance art of behaving like an amateur at a conference in order to get you ready for my topic. So thank you all for being here. My paper is called An Archive of One's Own, Fan Fiction as Amateur Criticism of Virginia Woolf. This is based on a piece for the Virginia Woolf Miscellany. When Virginia Woolf wrote that Chloe liked Olivia, she was careful not to say too much more on the subject. Nearly 100 years later, anonymous writers online have moved in the other direction. On the relevantly named fan fiction database Archive of Our Own, One author imagines a conversation between the mythical Chloe and Olivia, who are co-workers and lovers, as they discuss the controversial literature of the day, namely its representations of queer sex. How would you write The Well of Loneliness? Chloe asks. Olivia replies, I'd change that awful depressing title for a start. Something like The Tub of Contentment. She continued with a wicked smile, warming to her theme. And I'd put in a bit more proper description, how it looks, how it feels. In her desire for proper description of lesbian intimacy, this reimagined Olivia gives a mission statement for the genre of fan fiction itself. This genre generally denotes amateur works of fiction based on characters from existing works of literature, television, movies, and video games. Archive of Our Own, commonly known as AO3, is one of the internet's most popular and prolific hosts for these stories. Its name, inspired by Woolf's 1929 essay, marks its status as a fan-owned and fan-run web property, not subject to the censorship of corporate-owned sites like fanfiction.net. Although fanfiction has a long history, its contemporary iteration on AO3 often emphasizes queer lives, romances, and sex. Fanfic writers take to the web to reimagine mainstream culture stories as unapologetically queer. They are indeed invested in how it looks, how it feels. However, they also accomplish more ambitious intellectual ends, making critical interventions of their own on the works they adapt. Exploring this archive, especially when it comes to Woolf's own adaptations, leads us to prod the permeable barriers between fiction and criticism, amateur and professional, sex and sexuality studies. Though fandoms like the Avengers movie franchise and TV show Supernatural dominate, there are a surprising number of fan works that concern literary history in general and Woolf in particular. I want to argue that these stories, though written by anonymous amateurs online, comprise a form of literary criticism that deserves our attention. In thinking about amateur criticism, I am indebted to theories of amateurism by professional literary critics Carolyn Dinshaw, Melanie Messier, and Arfi Vadi. As Dinshaw writes, amateur literary activities can expose and critique professional literary activities. Amateur readings can help us to contemplate different ways of being, knowing, and world-making. Messier and Vade point to Woolf's own deliberate amateurism in Three Guineas. They argue that writerly amateurism emerged as a feminized pastime during the professionalization of English and other humanities disciplines in the early 20th century. Woolf herself rejected the siloing of academic knowledge into narrow careerist pursuits. As Messier and Vade demonstrate, Three Guineas embraces the amateur form of the scrapbook, cobbling together knowledge and insight in fragments from a wide variety of sources. Her methods fly in the face of the modernist orthodoxy of the highbrow, positing a feminist alternative. They write that Woolf's text is at, quote, the vanguard of an institutional critique that ties the professionalism of the university to larger capitalist transformations in the management of knowledge. I'm compelled by the claim that amateur criticism as pioneered by Woolf stands to exceed the neoliberal constraints of the university. If that's true, so too does an Archive of Our Own, a collectively fan-run and owned website, carry on that tradition. When students and fans of Woolf post their irreverent homework assignments or erotic reimaginings of canonical novels, they indeed blend the trivial with the serious, and with no profit in mind. The result is a scrapbook archive made in Woolf's own image. Because AO3 is an anonymous site, the authority of its writers goes unchecked. Woolf famously wrote that Anon, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. This updated digital anonymity, which allows writers to imagine queer sex and literary history alike, extends her argument. And in the online world, anonymity and amateurism go hand in hand. In this way, the fanfiction author comes to resemble Woolf's figure of the common reader, a personage she borrows and updates from Samuel Johnson, and which gives the name to 2 volumes of her criticism, published in 1925 and 1935. The common reader is certainly an amateur, one who reads for pleasure. She writes, and I know you all know this, he never ceases as he reads to write up some rickety and ramshackle fabric, which shall give him the temporary satisfaction of looking sufficiently like the real object to allow of affection, laughter, and argument. This description of promiscuous and pleasurable readership might also apply to the interpretive writing of AO3. Its authors, in constructing fantasies of Clarissa Dalloway and Sally Seton's pillow talk, do create objects that give the temporary satisfaction of looking like the real object. And for the readers, there is great affection, laughter, and argument to be found. Fanfiction, in effect, allows common readers to inscribe and share their reading in a creative digital forum. As stories on the after-hour hobbies of Chloe and Olivia suggest, one of the freedoms of the anonymous common writer is the exploration of erotic themes that Woolf herself could only allude to. Let us admit, in the privacy of our society, of course. Her audiences at Newnham and Girton colleges may have attempted such a community, but the internet offers us a different kind of privacy in society, as she put it. In the fanfic I quote above, Chloe doesn't only like Olivia, she kisses her, caresses her breasts and hips, holds her in her arms. In other stories on AO3, fic writers imagine embraces between Woolf characters Septimus Warren Smith and Evans, Clarissa Dalloway and Sally Seton, and Orlando and Sasha. In short, fanfiction offers readers and writers the opportunity to extend queer literary history to scenes of erotic intimacy and friendship, ones that may correspond to their own lives. In other stories, fanfiction provides readers and writers the opportunity to articulate reactions outside the literature classroom. Several users have shared Woolf-related essays originally written for class, creating a readership beyond their professors. One astute assignment switches Woolf's and James Joyce's trademark styles to impressive results. Another writer, Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp, who has seemingly created her AO3 account with the primary goal of critiquing To the Lighthouse, like so many male critics before her, ventriloquizes Woolf with a reverence that I find both childish and thrilling. And they write, "For you see, I am a female moth who believes in the Oedipal complex and is just trying to make it big in the world by publishing all of my friends' works because I can and I have that kind of power. Someone has blundered. It is certainly not me. Excuse me, I'm Virginia Woolf and I should be using less paragraph breaks." So this isn't a particularly generous rendition, but it does offer a synthesis of Woolf's well-known works, turning them inside out with wry skill. In addition, I think it shares a sensibility with professional criticism, a frustration with a text so intense that it leads to obsession or passion, spurring a piece of writing to articulate just what has gone wrong. Fanfiction also offers insights into Woolf's reception in the present day. While literary historians would recognize the precarious status of the Hogarth Press during its operation, younger readers perceive Woolf as always already canonical, an imperious figure who has that kind of power. Her canonical status makes her useful as a sage, legitimizing presence in epigraphs and elusive titles as well. Fanfics about everything from the video game Minecraft to professional soccer players use Woolf's language in quotation. Though we might call the combination of a passage from the waves, "There was a star riding through the clouds one night, and I said to the star, 'Consume me,' incompatible with the romantic story about Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man, I find the juxtaposition funny, charming, even generative. It aims to dismantle a hierarchy of literary taste, suggesting that we might find pleasure and leisure in Woolf's language, just as we find complex ideas in popular media. But the best examples of these stories make more ambitious interventions. Writing fiction that reinterprets a previous canonical work is a long-standing tradition, perhaps inaugurated by John Milton in Paradise Lost, and itself canonical retelling of the Bible's creation story. In the 20th century, Jean Rhys made the feminist retelling famous. In Wide Sargasso Sea, she repackages the story of Jane Eyre through the perspective of Mr. Rochester's mad wife in the attic, chronicling her childhood of colonial violence and isolation in Barbados. While Rhys's novel admits the centrality of Jane Eyre to the British literary tradition, her retelling constitutes a critique of its racism and narrow feminist vision. In Woolf studies, we have Michael Cunningham's The Hours, which manages to combine speculation about the lives of Mrs. Dalloway and Woolf herself. It would not be a denigrating label to call Cunningham's novel fan fiction, though it has been legitimized by publication. Like the amateur authors on the archive, Cunningham takes characters and themes from Woolf's writing and, in writing in her voice, both interprets and extends her work. The same is true of fan fiction. In one particularly elegant example, entitled La Chasse à la Renard, the Fox Hunt, AO3 user Breathed Out imagines a reunion between Orlando and her erstwhile paramour Sasha in 1929, just after the ending of the novel. In reflecting on their youthful entanglement, the characters grapple with the specter of gender transition. I think this is really smart. Sasha remarks, "You were always such a sweet girl." Orlando is astonished. "I believe you are misremembering," she protests. As she struggles to articulate her own gendered past, Sasha diverts her attention to other sense memories. Remember the ice skating? Remember the suppers? In this encounter, Sasha both affirms Orlando's womanhood and defers a hard and fast account of gender transition. Breathed Out's interpretation of the novel thus updates Orlando's experience with a more contemporary understanding of transgender identity, where one might experience womanhood before presenting externally that way. But Breathed Out also absorbs Woolf's habit of coyly refusing the biological and metaphysical rules of gender. Orlando's gender at the time of their icebound affair becomes a matter of contradictory memory between Sasha and Orlando, a matter they ultimately decide to let drop. We were children, Sasha says, children playing on the ice. Orlando agrees. It's a really beautiful moment. So if we acknowledge that fan fiction is a critical genre that uses fictional situations and speculation to make an intervention, we might notice that we are describing at least some of professional literary criticism as well. Learning to value amateur forms of criticism would also require us to acknowledge the invigorating presence of amateurism in our own scholarship. And I think Drew talked about this so eloquently with regard to the pull that we feel towards those archives that is so personal as well as professional. This is especially true in Woolf studies, where admiration and attachment are often present in scholarly interest. So might we think of literary criticism as a kind of fanish genre, shaped by historical rigor and imaginative extension alike? In so doing, we can express solidarity with Woolf herself, a self-published literary critic with no formal training, as well as with the irreverent queer critics of Archive of our own, who make her legacy feel more vibrant than ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Well, so much. I have so many questions for all three of you, but I do think we should take one more break. Maybe two, we're 2 minutes from the top of the hour, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So let's reconvene at the top of the hour and maybe take this moment to stretch your legs or write down a question or two for our speakers. Okay, it is noon. Apologies if I've been saying the wrong time. I am in the central time zone, so I'm an hour behind the time that is on the program. So it's still technically late morning for me. But okay, so it's noon. I have been sort of looking in the chat to track questions, and Tori can maybe draw attention to questions I miss. But you all, many of you are Zoom veterans, so you know the routine. Down at the bottom of the page, there is a reactions button on your Zoom screen. If you click that, there is a little icon that says raise hand. If you do that, I'm in gallery view right now. I'll see you. You'll be popped to the top of my my screen, and I'll see you that you have a question, and I'll go ahead and call on you. I will privilege people who are willing to talk out loud, unfortunately, but in the sort of moments between those questions, I'll take a peek in the chat. Nicola, I see you have your hand up, so why don't you start us off?
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for those really great papers. Oh, sorry. Josh, I was wondering, I really appreciated the Hans Walter Gabler work and that distinction between autographic and allographic text, which I hadn't come across before. And I was just wondering how you see that interacting with. So I've looked at kind of, Brenda R. Silver's work about like, it's that essay, textual one about who's afraid of Virginia Woolf's textual practice, where she does that kind of feminist, she makes it a feminist argument, kind of leveling of the drafts and the published, and kind of arguing that everything is equally important in some ways, which seems slightly different to what you were perhaps suggesting, or what Gabler is suggesting through that framework. And I just wondered really how, or if you've used Silver or found that helpful, or if you see a distinction between those two ideas or not really. But yeah, thank you everyone for papers.
Thank you for that, Nicola. I'll admit to having not read Silver's essay for quite a while, but thank you for sort of drawing my attention back to it in this context. And yes, I guess that is a really interesting question. About the tension between on the one hand, the binary Hans Walter Gabler draws, and the, as you say, the leveling that Silver gestures towards. I guess what I'd try to argue is that Walter Gabler is talking about mode. He's sort of thinking almost procedurally, or sort of in terms of modes of production, how he's thinking about how, as a genetic critic, about how a book, a text, a document is made. So his language is sort of couched very much in that sort of almost teleology that leads from a germ or an idea or a few scribbled notes through drafts, through drafts, handwritten drafts, through typescripts and proofs and galleys, and all the way to the published text that the reader holds.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, sorry, you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I thought
No, not at all. I'm really glad that you brought it up. I mean, sort of having been trained as a genetic critic, it can become quite hard to step out of that framework. So thank you for giving me pause to think about it.
No, that's right. It's really helpful because we look at drafts quite a lot with teaching, and that giving them that language as well is quite helpful. Other than this is everything and everything's important. But yeah, it's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I believe you have your hand up. You want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you so much for all of those papers. They were fantastic. My question is kind of a general question that I guess brings together all three of the papers. Do you think that there is an element of the amateur or the anonymous maybe in Woolf's diaries in the way that her diaries contain a sort of fragmented scrapbook self? They're sometimes fragmented, and they're sometimes in some cases redrafted. She takes an entry and makes changes to it. And yeah, I just wonder kind of what you thought about that.
Josh, do you want to go?
Yes, I think that, I mean, I think that the diaries are, well, it's hard to say that they are one thing or another because they are so many things at the same time. But what really strikes me is that she uses them as almost as a space for thinking, and not just sort of, and as a way of what do I want to say? There's this sort of continuous back and forth between them and her other writings, her novels and her essays, which I find endlessly fascinating. She sort of returns to them, and when she's writing, I don't know, I did some work on the 1917 scene in the years, and when she's writing that scene, she writes in her diary about returning to her old diaries. And when you read those old diaries, she sort of replicates scenes that she had written about all those decades ago. Memories of, in this case, sort of sheltering from an air raid in Hogarth House. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of one of the things I draw from.
Well, and one of the things I can think of in terms of the word amateur as well, when I hear the word amateur, I think of the fact that it comes from the Latin verb amare, to love. And so I feel like that the word amateur meant, we use amateur in a kind of pejorative way sometimes. And I think that the word amateur is someone who can sometimes do a thing for the sheer love of doing a thing. And I think what you see in Woolf's diary is that she sort of repairs to the diary, which is an interesting verb for it, to, in a way, recuperates from the rigor of writing a formal text. And you see her return to the page in order to write for the sheer love of writing. And one of the interesting things about looking at the manuscripts of the diaries versus the manuscripts of the novels, Olivier Bell points this out very early on. You look at the novel manuscripts and there are a zillion crossouts and arrows and things that are rethought. In the diary, almost nothing is crossed out. You look at the manuscripts of the diaries and she crosses out very infrequently. And so I feel that when she's keeping the diary, it's an act of love for the word. It's an act of love for, in a sense, I almost feel like that there's an exuberance in the diary. It's why I like reading it so much, because she's doing it out of a sense of love for the process. I don't know if that answers your question either.
Yeah, for sure. That's really, really helpful. I'm actually wondering what Anna thinks about that, because she talked a lot about that. The sort of amateur form of the scrapbook as well was a quote from your paper, which I really enjoyed. So that potentially in connection with the diary.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's true of all of Woolf's writing, and she was always very clear. You think about like On Not Knowing Greek and pieces like that sort of pay attention to her own lack of sort of institutional access and knowledge, that she sort of espoused a amateur attitude towards all of her writing. And I think because of that lack of institutional access and sort of professional credentials, there was always a kind of blurring between the personal and the professional and the public and private. So the diary is a place, I think Drew's totally right, that it's a place you repair to, that writing becomes personal again. But there's obviously so much connection and overlap between the published and the unpublished. And so all of that becomes both part of her professional legacy, as Drew talked about, that we have access to, and yet all of it is unpaid, unsponsored in that way.
Thank you so much.
Mark, go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot I put my hand. I was so lost in reverie listening to Anna there. Such three great papers. And just a couple of comments. I was thinking how it's so interesting how Woolf herself uses her diary. Like she goes back, and one that sticks in my mind always is that little note where she sort of marks, this is where the waves begins. So, I mean, she doesn't write that, but she says something about moths leading to. So she's clearly like reading back through her own diary as if it were a scrapbook that she can kind of flip through and see what she was thinking. But I put this question in the chat, and I just wondered, Drew, about her use of the word papers. Will you destroy all my papers? Does that kind of let us off the hook ethically, because it's so nebulous? I mean, it might have mean all my bank statements, all my personal financial records.
Right.
rather than all my writing or all my diaries, or, you know, papers is, it's such an official sounding word to me.
That's such a good question, Mark, and it gets at the heart of why I'm troubled by that final sentence. If you want my honest opinion, sitting here right now, even after having delivered that paper, I still think she meant diaries when she said papers. I still feel troubled by it, because I don't think she meant her finished manuscripts. I don't think that's what she was thinking of. I think she was thinking of her private papers. I really do. And I guess that's why I'm still always going to be slightly troubled by the work I'm doing. But I feel like the other thing that I didn't mention in the paper too is if we believe in the timeline of suicide notes, you know, we have the two. If we believe in the ordering of those, and that she may have tried to kill herself a week before she succeeded, my thought is that if she really wanted those private papers destroyed, she could have done so herself, and she didn't. And I still maintain that I don't think she probably genuinely believed Leonard would have done it.
And she rescued them from her bombed out house too.
Right, shortly before, well, I guess 2 years before. And I don't know. I love that you have kind of given me an out in a sense by saying maybe she meant bank statements.
Well, I really don't think, I really disagree with you that she meant, given how careful she is about language, I can't imagine her calling her diary my papers. It just.
Good point. Good point.
Go ahead, Drew.
But yeah. But I also think that I also think that she was in the depths of despair when she wrote that sentence. I also make myself feel better by saying she didn't really know what she was saying. I can't think that she would really believe that these manuscripts were worth destruction. I mean, I think she knew their value. She's constantly talking about their value within the manuscript of the diaries. So yeah, I'm torn, and I think I'm always going to be torn, but that's it. Okay. I can live with it.
Gwen asks a question related to this. I do see other hands up, but since this was so related, I wanted to just mention, she was wondering if, you know, when Woolf writes about rescuing those papers, the diaries, a couple years earlier, did Woolf use the word papers to talk about the diaries, or where else does Woolf use the word papers, if ever, to describe her own
specifically
work?
Rescuing them from Mecklenburg Square, she says diaries.
Okay.
She specifically says diaries in the diary. She says, okay, I went and I got my diaries.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that would be interesting to track that. Does she ever use the word papers to describe her own writing, if at all, ever? So that would be curious. Lots of stuff in the chat, so hopefully we will save it and get back to it. But Nicola, your hand went back up. Did you want to tack onto that, or a new question?
Sorry, yeah, it was just to continue this discussion really, which seems to open up so much around ethics, Drew. And I was just thinking about, you know, how this, I mean, if this isn't known, I don't know the history of all this and that comment, but doesn't it kind of open up things in the same way that, like, the Catherine Mansfield, that kind of whole legacy around her papers, where there was a comment about Middleton Murray was making soup of the bones through papers on, and also, you know, the whole Plath and Ted Hughes. And
I was just going to say, right.
This was also potentially part of, or perhaps that's too sensational, but I hadn't appreciated that was part potentially of what we have with Woolf's diaries. I don't know if you want,
yeah, I think that the Plath and Hughes comparison is pretty interesting as well. I don't know. I'd have to ponder that more, Nicola. Yeah.
All right, Nancy, go ahead.
I just so I make documentary films, so I am an amateur in the Woolf space, which is it's kind of fun to be celebrated as an amateur. But I've taken the approach that the dead do not have the right to privacy, and I feel that way because in excavating lives, which is what I do, which is why thank you all for these papers and this panel. It's fantastic. You know, that's just my opinion, and I may be informed by being Jewish, because, you know, in Judaism the needs of the living are always more important than the needs of the dead. But I guess I'm just curious about what other people think about that, because you know, I also just want to say that having spent weeks at UCLA working on Sontag's papers and notebooks, I found a letter that I think the curators, I don't understand why they didn't take it out of the collection, but it was a letter to Sontag from somebody else describing a mental health crisis by another person who was still alive at that time. And after a lot of hesitation, I wrote to the person who wrote the letter and I said, do you realize this is in the archive? And I just read it and I didn't want to have found this out. It was terrible. And that person, and I hesitated to do that too, because I was invading his privacy again. And he thanked me and he wrote to them and they pulled the letter. But I was kind of shocked that the curators, having gone through all this material, didn't think about the privacy of a living person. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking, but I was curious about the part about the privacy of the dead. Thank you.
And everybody watch Nancy's documentary on Susan Sontag regarding Susan Sontag. It's excellent. Go.
And they don't always go through the archives. I mean, they're just in boxes there's places where there are archives that no one has ever looked at. Mm-hmm. The librarians drop them in a box and walk away because they don't have enough staff. So that may be how Nancy found them.
Yeah, Nancy, I think that's such a vexed question, and I think that's why it's fascinating just to think about the conclusion that the scholars I quoted come to with, is it okay to do this? Well, it depends. That's the answer. And I like how you said this really does come to a matter of, it comes down to the personal opinion and the comfort level of the researcher. I think that's where a lot of it lands, which is awfully muddy. I kind of would love, maybe again, this is being brought up Catholic, maybe this is like there are the right things and wrong things, and you want a definitive answer, but there just isn't one.
I think this also reminds me, I saw a question earlier. I think Mitchell asked a question during Anna's talk about, is there fan fiction that isn't just about Woolf's characters, but about Woolf herself? And the problem being alive or dead, I think, factors into whether we find that weird or not. But there's plenty of RFP fanfic about actors who are very much alive, right? And so this living dead, real fictional dynamic, I think, plays out really interestingly in fan on AO3 and fan fiction as well. Anna, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but I just wanted to raise that issue there too.
No, absolutely. And I have complicated feelings about RPF, and I think there's like immense stories about, like, very sexually explicit stories about actors and famous hockey players and things like that. I think most fan fiction people would say it's fine as long as you don't confront the real person with that story about themselves, which people like to do at cons. You like read the story about yourself out loud, which obviously is unfair, but I have complicated feelings about it.
Thank you, Anna. Ollie, go ahead.
Thanks, Ben. And before I start, just thank you to all three presenters. It was a really fascinating panel. I keep going over in my head this phrase, "Will you destroy all my papers?" I can't seem to stop repeating it. I think it's really caught me. And I just wonder if knowing what we do about Leonard and Virginia's relationship, I wonder if there's any scope or possibility for seeing those final words as almost a kind of provocation to Leonard to think about what to do with all her papers, whether they be papers or diaries or I know it's finished with a full stop rather than a question, so and that complicates it. But I just wonder if we can see it as a kind of, as a nudge for him to start thinking about what to do with her legacy.
Well, that's really interesting, Ollie. That I had never read it that way. I had never read it. I had read it as, in a sense, a command. And she's saying, "Will you destroy all my papers? Is that what you're going to do with my literary remains? What are you going to do?" That's really interesting. I hadn't read it that way. Everybody else want to weigh in on that? I'll have to think about that for a long time, Ollie. Thank you.
I think that was a powerful provocation, Ollie. So thank you.
Yeah.
If anyone else wants to weigh in, you're certainly welcome. But otherwise, Ellen, I think you're up.
Yeah, I actually, when you said it, I thought of it as a question. Is that what you're going to do? I want to speak just to, because I was thinking of Samuel Johnson's piece in the Ramblers on life writing. It's a long, very, very interesting meditation. But the very end, I can't remember it by heart. Was prompted by the moon who talked about death. He says we should regard the memory of the dead, and that means their feelings, how they feel about whatever they want to, like what sex life they had. But he says we owe more to knowledge, virtue, and truth. And as I remember the Rambler, there's a couple of paragraphs on the importance of increasing knowledge, sheer knowledge. So we wouldn't know a lot about. Imagine if we didn't have her diaries, how much less we would know about her. And I'm thinking of the case, the one that I did a lot of scholarship is Austen. The feeling is that Cassandra destroyed 2/3 of her letters. And this really suggesting, and that she censored the others. And so you can't begin to know about her what you could have known, and it wouldn't have done her any harm. And then the idea of virtue and truth. So virtue comes in between, but the truth. So I think we ought to. I think we ought to have more emphasis on the idea that when you do destroy these things, you're destroying knowledge, and some of it is really very important and very hurtful. We wouldn't begin to know. And there is a big difference. This is just because I do see these fan fictions online. As you know, there's a tremendous amount of fan fiction in Austen. But on some of the lesser ones, I may bring up in this Borgas group, Outlander, some of the things that sometimes I find, I don't know them personally, distressing, where people do something they call ship actors. They actually write about these actors who are presented as making love in the series and say that they're lovers outside. This, I think, is very wrong. I just have to say that when there's a great difference between living and dead. And I would censor that. I would not, if I owned a website, I wouldn't let people do that to living people. It's different once you're dead. So just a comment, but I think I really want to emphasize knowledge, that word knowledge, in Johnson's piece in the Rambler. Thank you. Very interesting, very interesting.
Can I just throw out another phrase?
Please, Diane.
Ethel Smythe wrote to Virginia and she said, "What shall I do with your letters?"
Yes.
Virginia wrote back and said, "Let posterity decide."
Right.
That's another good phrase.
Thank you, Diane. I feel better.
Georgi, please go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I also wanted to return to the point that Drew made about that if Virginia wanted to destroy, maybe she would have done it. And just as an example from Russian literature history, I remembered how Nikolai Gogol, right before his death, he burnt the second volume of his novel, Dead Souls, and there are speculations that he was mentally ill and so on, but most of the scholars think that actually he understood that he doesn't want to this work to be read by people, so by readers, and it was his decision. And I think that Virginia was able to do it, and if she really would have wanted to do it, maybe she would have done it. So yeah, kind of support to this position.
Yes, thank you.
All right, great comments. Beth, hand is up.
I guess I have real trouble thinking about destroying the papers, not just because she read diaries so much, but also because her criticism is so heavily invested in knowing something about the people who were writing. And she used diaries and memoirs in her practice. I mean, it wasn't just the reading voraciously of diaries. She used that in her practice of criticism, writing essays. And so that makes me think, would she really want to have been that unknown? Because I suspect she was frustrated by not knowing more about Jane Austen, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
And there was a question farther back in the chat. I noticed that was I looking at the actual physical diaries and not just the microfilm? No, the actual physical diaries. I was able to make enough of a case with the Berg that they did bring out the individual volumes one by one, but I had to fight for that. That took a lot of time. That took 3 years. That took 3 years of repeated visits to the Berg, asking to see them over and over again. I think either they finally understood that I really did need to see them, or they were sick of me asking the question, one or the other. I think those days are over. I think they pretty much are now. I don't know that I will ever get to see them again, but I did get to see them once.
Was this Isaac who wasn't letting you have access?
Yes.
Lovely man. He did seriously love Virginia Woolf's Walking Stick. Everything else was of no interest whatsoever. I liked him a lot, obviously not.
Right. Right. Yeah, but
I think we all felt it, Vara. It just came through my computer screen.
Yeah, and it would, and Nicola's comment there. I think it'd be interesting to see, and I don't know for certain whether I will not get to see them again. I need to go back to the Berg for various other things before I finish the book. But a lot of what I can do now can be done on microfilm. But I did see each of the individual volumes one at a time. Everything that's in their possession, I did get to examine. I think that may no longer be the case. So I feel very fortunate to have seen those things.
I was just going to say too, I think with regard to like Woolf saying at one point in her life versus what's in the final note, we have this sense that there isn't one sort of consolidated, consistent version of her that has a really,
right.
And I think it's very true that like, and we learned this from Woolf herself, right? The sort of like spectrum and scattering of subjectivity and personhood over the course of her life. And I think as Woolf critics, we feel this very strongly as we fight the sort of representation of her in popular culture as a suicidal woman and sort of trying to like add complexity to that narrative that her suicidal self was not her fullest or most representative self. And I'm interested in this too as it comes to out her life after death. And I'm interested in what Nancy says about not having the privacy, the dead not having the right to privacy. And it makes me wonder to what extent she is dead, at least from an ethical perspective. And I've been working on this portmanteau Woolf, Virginia Woolf miscellany piece and thinking about her continued legacy and representations having an ongoing ethical register, especially with regard to feminist representations and how we represent women writers and their legacy. And do we feel a different kind of responsibility to her as an ongoing figure who has sort of like material impact on the world, or do we only care about her physical life?
What a great comment, and what a great session, and what a great panel. I think if we can say thank you and congratulations to our 3 presenters. Thank you so much for giving us so much on the final day of this amazing conference. Okay, folks, maybe we can let people go, or you can linger as long as the session is left open, but I hope to see many of you later today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. We have to go. We have a meeting, right?